Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor and privilege to introduce our keynote speaker this evening. Mr. Janez Janša is a two-time Prime Minister of Slovenia and is the head of the Slovenian Democratic Party, the head of the opposition today in Ljubljana. Over the past several months, we've met at various occasions where conservatives are gathering, getting to know each other, strategizing, hopefully to be more effective in the future. I would say my own experience in politics, which has been limited the last 3 years, I see the left is shameless in promoting bad ideas. Ideas that make people poorer, make people miserable. And in our countries here in Central Europe, they are shameless about the past as well. I was in Parliament earlier today with our friends from Spain and other visitors, and we saw some of the paintings in the Parliament building. One depicts a solemn occasion when Croatia adopted its new constitution in December of 1990. President Tudjman was there, the Sabor was full. But the reality is that the people, almost all males, in the painting, probably 90% were members of the Communist Party. That's the reality, 90% of them. And so we must deal with this question of lustration, which hasn't happened in Croatia. We suffer the consequences of that. Mr. Janša knows firsthand what I'm speaking of. He suffered in the 80s under the communist regime. So he has much to tell us, and I think accumulated wisdom from his long time of service in politics. We're deeply honored that you accepted our invitation. We'll have limited time, but we have the opportunity for questions after the keynote speech called Global Strategy. So, Mr. Prime Minister, the floor is yours.
So thank you, Mr. Bartolca, for kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid I prepared a more theoretical speech, which won't be so interested as some other panels you held here this summer university were. But before I start, I would like to add something to the previous panel where distinguished participants described how to present the past when they described the difficulties they met when they tried to speak the truth or to picture the truth. I don't know if somebody here visited European Museum of the European History in Brussels. This is an institution which costed the European taxpayers 100 million euros or something. It's a huge, nice building. But when you visit this museum, especially if you're coming from the eastern part of Europe, you will be very disappointed. For instance, the history of Slovenia or Croatia or all nations who had lived in former Yugoslavia is pictured like, well, for Slovenia, there are a few pictures of the life during the communism. There is the exhibition of this small car, Fico. We draw, it was generations too old for modern transport during our lifetime. But the life during the communist system in Slovenia, there is pictured as simple and more or less funny. There is very little about the real face of the communist regime. And if you carefully walk through the halls of this museum, you will very rarely find the word communism. They are using the word Stalinism, which is, well, something accurate for Soviet Union, but, you know, the avoidance of using the real word, even in this museum, and we expect it a lot when this institution has been built, is telling us where we are now. And I will try to describe how I see the current situation, political situation, ideological situation in the western part of the globe, and how I see this struggle which is going on between the culture of death and the culture of life currently. As we all know, Western civilization is fundamentally based on the 10 commandments of God. However you read them, you will find this. And those fundaments of the Western civilization have been under a systemic attack during the last 2 centuries. In the Communist Manifesto of 1848, it is stated directly that the precondition for establishing a classless society of equality is the breakdown of the key foundations of Western civilization. This involves the breakdown or destruction of the family, nation, private property, private schools, and religion. At the same time, the abolition of representative democracy and the establishment of rule of the people is the goal. Following the instructions of Marx, Engels, and Lenin, the implementation of the manifesto began with revolutionary terror. In a good part of the planet, communist dictatorship was established by violence. A society under the communist dictatorships is, without exemptions, pushed into the culture of death, into the sacrifice for a greater future. Veiled by perils and nice words of equality, social justice, and, of course, eternal struggle for classless society, when we will be able to create heaven on earth. Because there were no conditions for violent seize of power in the western part, or in some more developed environments in Northern and Western Europe and Northern America, individual advocates of Marxism conceived a different path for breaking down the foundations of Western civilization. They called it cultural Marxism. In terms of values, it represents a culture of death. In technical terms, it is a formula. First discredit and then liquidate. According to their plan, it is necessary to first occupy the institutions that shape human values and then devalue the family, nation, religion, private education, and private property through them as much as possible. When those values are sufficiently discredited, most of the population will no longer defend them. As Antonio Gramsci first wrote, newspapers, publishers, universities, and cultural institutions must first be occupied. In the century after Gramsci, technological and general development automatically added radio, film, television, and social networks to the list. Among the institutions that need to be specifically occupied and controlled, all international and multinational organizations have been added. various factions of the culture of that, especially corporate socialism or fascism, international and national socialism, have chosen partly different emphasis and ways of destroying the foundation of Western civilization, but all have attacked its essence, its spiritual dimension. This is religion. The factions of corporate fascism and national socialism were dismantled at the end of the World War II. Marxism, in the dimension of international socialism, even strengthened territorially until the end of the Cold War, when it seemed to collapse. In fact, it only fully transformed into cultural Marxism. Slovenian communists describe this transition by claiming that the Berlin Wall fell on both sides. Cuban communists responded by founding the Sao Paulo Forum, which today controls the majority of Latin America. And one of the founders is again current president of Brazil, Lula da Silva. He is the founder of Sao Paulo Forum 33 years ago. Former working class or proletariat as the carrier of progress has gradually been replaced by all those categories that can be justifiably or manipulatively labeled as minority, unprivileged, or oppressed. The classical Marxist goal, once openly named socialism as a world process, has been masked and more neutrally sounding humanitarian, social, and environmental global goals. Uniform formations with swastikas or red stars on their caps have been replaced by urban Antifa, awakened individuals and organizations, and numerous other leftist, so-called non-governmental organizations that are supposed to represent all oppressed and minority categories in society. Wherever leftists have access to public funds, they massively finance the so-called modern civil society. Organizations that invent all sorts of things to achieve the goals of cultural Marxism, invent gender theory, special LGBT human rights, summarize justification for euthanasia like Hitler did, invent new social or racial injustices and their alleged victims every day. These groups, who were not elected by anyone and have no contribution to common good, receive incredibly rich financial injections from state budgets or various domestic and foreign foundations. In Latin America, they are also heavily funded by drug cartels. Leftists finance hundreds of various civil initiatives, quasi-institutes, and quasi-cultural events that serve to discredit the foundations of Western civilization. Often also as a political army that organizes street protests and violence when the left is not in power. The rules of the pre-election campaign do not apply to them in most countries. There is usually no control over the expenditure of money for their political struggle. Even more, many such associations are also richly funded from the EU funds, while some European and international conventions grant them a special status in decision-making process, especially during last decades regarding environmental issues. In this way, alongside classic political and multinational organizations and corporations, a special supportive structure of cultural Marxism is established and financially supported, and this no one elected. They usually call themselves the voice of the people. We know that during the communist or socialist times, everything was people's. People's republic, people's property, people's everything. So whatever was not democratically elected was the called voice of the people, and we are back again. The most important role of this rule of the unelected is in many cases the destruction of the culture of life, that is, everything that represents the real traditional social capital of the community. And we must take this strict rule of the unelected seriously, as it deliberately weakens or even destroys representative democracy. This is the strategic goal of cultural Marxism. Free elections in an environment where basic political freedoms, especially freedom of speech, free economic initiative, and equal rules for all, are central problems of cultural Marxism. For many people in former communist countries in Central and Eastern Europe, it is incomprehensible that a large part of the financial support for the extreme left or destructive interventions of cultural Marxism comes from the capitalist West. However, this financial support is not so illogical. It is not based solely on the common denial of the spiritual dimension of man. An individual without strong emotional ties to their environment, means family, local community, nation, and moral values, Ten Commandments, is the logical meeting point between cultural Marxism and political globalization. Both prefer a pliable and spendthrift consumer, a person without attachment to home, local community, and nation, a person without oikophilia, as Sir Roger Scruton would say, a person who is only connected to the virtual network and their screens, a consumer who they can access directly without formal, national, and moral barriers. At the same time, there is nothing better for a financial speculator, for instance, Mr. Soros, than a spendthrift socialist government that borrows heavily and whose taxpayers then pay high interest rates. With the extremely dangerous and frighteningly successful march of cultural Marxism through our civilization, instead of an increasingly free, relaxed, and orderly environment for the individual, we get a semblance of freedom, in which freedom is what the unelected label as freedom. In Slovenia, we currently have a government led by a party which is called Movement of Freedom. We all know how the word freedom was misused during the communist time, and we came back again. Whoever refuses to be blinded or refuses to submit becomes a problem. If they speak out loudly, they are accused of hate speech. They are publicly persecuted and discredited. If they try to connect with others who do not accept the illusions, they are declared fascists. This is the most common label for everybody who is opposing cultural Marxism. If they resist, the so-called independent, unelected judiciary persecutes and suppresses them. So Western civilization is not under attack from some other, more advanced culture. It is under attack from structures that want to destroy it, but do not offer an alternative. Only its illusions, which then, when we unveil the veil of cultural Marxist illusions, reveals the socialist chaos of today's Cuba or Venezuela. This is the practice result. We are not witnessing a clash of civilization, but a barbaric attack on civilization. We are witnessing an attack by the culture of death on the culture of life, an attack that is far from a clash of two equally powerful sides, but a brutal conquering march of the culture of death through the valleys of Western civilization. So far, unfortunately, it has been very successful. Very successful because it was skillfully disguised by the perversion of concepts. So that the central discourse today, language, language no longer describes reality. Because the culture of death or cultural Marxism was sold wrapped in the cloak of liberalism, human rights, and especially during last decades, environmental protection. Because it has been globally led and also financed. So, cultural Marxism is the main ideology of the current political left in the West, being this admitted or not. They speak about equality, social justice, and a better future, always. But when they are asked about economic growth, jobs, high inflation, housing problems, education, real problems we are facing, their answer is, in every corner of the globe is the same. Equality, social justice, LGBT rights, reproductive rights, etc. This is why when they have governmental power or absolute power, they produce only poverty. They don't know how to solve problems of today, but they know how to promise a better future. Better future delivered by the state, by the collective, by somebody else, without a hard and responsible work of an individual, somebody else. They know how to mislead the voters and what are the tools they need for manipulation. They heavily use, as Douglas Murray once said, envy and resentment. There is always somebody else responsible for their failures. There is always an enemy responsible for their bad fortune. There is always somebody to hate. It is true that not all the political landscape described as the left or green left today is totally consumed by cultural Marxism. There are still some political parties which has not included all Marxist weaponry into their program. But there is not a single influential political party which describes itself as a left or even center-left and which dares to openly opposes the main narrative of the cultural Marxism. I don't know for anybody. The conquering campaign of the culture of death through Western civilization, the conquering campaign of the culture of death through Western civilization has been very successful also because the destructive power of the culture of death was underestimated and the resistance was insufficiently organized. One of the essential initial mistakes of this resistance was the repetition of the fallacy of the beginnings of classical Marxism, according to which material conditions themselves would change people's conscience. Many individuals from the camp of the culture of life believed that the economy, the forum of liberal democracy itself, and technology would, by themselves, deal with the fallacies of cultural Marxism. Of course, this did not happen. So, we must admit this mistake and say clearly and loudly, it's not the economy, stupid. On the contrary, wealth created precisely due to conservative values, life forces and evolutionary abilities of modern capitalism were abused in many places to destroy its foundations. And this even though classical conservative philosophers warned of the dangers of cultural Marxism from the very beginning. We cannot say we were not warned. Unfortunately, their ideas were not followed by an effective organization at the national and international level quickly and strongly enough. Today, within the framework of the Western civilization circle, we have only two governments that openly and fully resist this danger, in Poland and Hungary. And only few international political organizations which fully realize that the values of the Western civilization, its fundamental rights, must be defended when they are under attack. The left, inspired by culture Marxism, is using envy, hate, and resentment. To confront them, we must use love, gratitude, and aspiration. Love to our families and countries, gratitude to our ancestors, aspiration to create something our successor will be proud of. In the Holy Bible, in the Gospel of John, we read, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. All things were made through Word, and without it was not anything made that was made." Therefore, we must regain the Word. This is the focus of the fight. We must regain the language that will describe the reality. We must name things and phenomena for what they are. And we must regain a full freedom of speech. We must regain the autonomy of the family and the sovereignty of the nation. We must regain schools where there is no place for cultural Marxism and the culture of that. We must regain sufficient space in universities, publishing houses, media, cultural institutions, and social networks. We must defend and regain democracy that will be the rule of voters and the elected. The masks have fallen, but the real fight only begins and the culture of life will prevail. We are living the time of reconquest. But I want to conclude with more practical suggestion. When in my party or in conservative intellectual circles of Slovenia, try to scope what's really going on. Why the left is so successful, despite they never scored good results when they had government. Why was so difficult to win elections when our governments had the best economic results in the history? And when we started to study similar cases across the world, and when we came to the what we believe the core problems, and when we discovered that the left in Slovenia is using the same tools, the same formula, the same ideology as the left in Latin America or in some other countries, and that they are connected with the same, not only with the same ideology, but also with the same practices in many times. And when we started to look for tools to be successful in the fight, we discovered this book. This book was written by Alejandro Pena Esclusa. I know that somebody Some of you met this name. He is author from Venezuela, suffered under the Maduro's regime. Now he just got last week political asylum in Italy, where he's living with his family. And he wrote this book years ago, which is called, this is Spanish version, it's also in English, in Italian language. It was translated in Slovenian language at the beginning of this year. I think it's just fresh from printing house in Hungary and Poland. It was published in Portugal, some other countries. He's describing the work of Sao Paulo Forum. This is the forum which was created after the fall of the communist, of the Berlin Wall, of the Soviet Union, when the communists in Latin America, especially in Cuba, realized that there is no one big power supporting them, and then people will start to ask, is there any future for socialism or communism? And then they met in Sao Paulo, and they discovered Antonio Gramsci and Frankfurt School and all these scholars of cultural Marxism. And when they were successful in Venezuela, they used the vast financial power of developed country, which Venezuela was before Maduro, to spread the cultural Marxism across Latin America. And now they are controlling, I think, the majority of the states in Latin America, with Brazil included, the most populous country there. There have been many books written about cultural Marxism. I'm sure that many of you have read some of them, but they are too theoretical. The advantage of this book is that it's very thin. People are not afraid to take it into its hands, and it's on Amazon, you can get it everywhere. When we published it at the beginning of this year in Slovenia, it has become a bestseller, which is strange, because now people are not reading books, they are watching smartphones and whatever is going on through the digital messages. But this book is a bestseller, not only in Slovenia, also in some other countries. You will ask how this is possible that such a book is bestseller in Slovenia, because it's speaking about Latin America. You know, when we introduce it, I asked the hall, which was and the crowd, which was bigger than this, have you somebody, few, have ever heard about Sao Paulo Forum? There was nobody in the room. There was nobody in the room. But now, after half a year and something, I'm meeting people in my country who read this book, and they tell me, now I understand the things. Now I understand why this is going on in Slovenia. Because there are parallels. There are stories here which can be easily used to describe the situation in Croatia, other parts of Central and Eastern Europe, also in some Western European countries. And I read this book before it was translated. I met many people during meetings of our political international, and people coming from Latin America, the leaders of the parties which are suffering under those regimes there, dissidents, they're describing the situation very practically, very clearly. And when I had been trying to describe this situation, then to our people, I always had difficulties, but not after they read this book. So I recommend it to everybody. It's really something which is changing the situation. I read many books in my life, but this is one of the most important. Despite it doesn't seem like that, it's very thin and simple. And the author Alejandro Pena-Esclusa has just got full asylum, political asylum in Italy, so he is free to travel across the Europe, and he is very prepared to represent the book. And when people are listening to him, he's very good orator, much better than I am. They start to think about the issues. And this is the beginning of the changes. This is the beginning of the changes. And next good news is that the same author, Alejandro, wrote a second book speaking about the same issue. And this is how those regimes linked with this Sao Paulo network of cultural Marxism are cheating the elections after they come to power. Because they realize that, of course, they promise everything, they use the money from Venezuela, from cartels, to bribe the people, voters, they organize the protests and so on. And they become the government, the presidents, the prime ministers. And then there are practical issues they have to solve, and they don't know how to, and there is no successful socialist government in history, as we all know. So it's difficult to be re-elected. So they developed all kinds of tricks how to adopt the electoral system, how to adapt the machines which are counting the votes. Some companies are very well known also from the elections in the United States. So I also recommend this second book. I don't have a copy here. It was just published in Slovenian language. And when we read it, we realized that we have some similar problems in our electoral system we were not aware of. We were not aware of. In a country which has been member of the European Union and NATO now for 15 years, and where we thought that there shouldn't be something wrong with the system itself. It is. It is, and we were not aware of this until we read this book. So this is all. I apologize for these ads at the end, but if you read the book, you will realize it was worthless.
So I want to thank Prime Minister Janša for that measured, insightful, forward-looking keynote speech. Maybe it could be summarized by the saying, socialists promise heaven but deliver hell. That's a very good summary way of putting the actual reality when the left is in power. So we have a few minutes for questions. I'll open the floor to the audience. Just raise your hand and we'll get the microphone to you. Okay, thank you.
Good day, Prime Minister Janša. Thank you for this wonderful lecture. My name is Petar Šarić. I am a recently graduated student of sociology and philosophy and a member of a few active NGOs in Croatia, like the Center for Analysis and Economic Activities. And one thing comes to my mind after hearing your lecture and the previous roundtable, and that's the concept of communism. So when we talk about communism and socialism, these are, very wide topics which contain a lot of specific principles. And my question is, which specific principles in communism do you consider to be the most problematic? So you've told us about Marx, about all these theorists which dominate this sphere of influence. But like I said, when we talk about the wide idea of communism, there are specific things which could be addressed. So for instance, there is the element of authoritarianism, there is the element of etatism or the state influence in the economy, there is the element of high level of bureaucracy, there is the element of collectivism, which maybe in some instances isn't even so bad. I mean, religion could be explained as a certain specific type of collectivism or maybe even sovereignism at that point. So to get back to my original point, which of these or some other principles do you consider to be the most problematic in the ideology of communism?
Well, I think that the most problematic thing with the communism is that this is not alternative. This is ideology, how to destroy something. Unfortunately, very effective. By violence, but also by discreditation, as cultural Marxism is using this path. But there is no alternative. So this is not something which is able to bring to the humanity a better way of life. And what's the most amazing is that this has been proven during the history many times. But still, no, they're going on. They're going on. Of course, the left now is not using the word communism anymore. There are some very radical left parties which are openly use this word during the election campaigns and so on. We have one such party which is part of governmental coalition today in Slovenia. It's called the Left Party, established by people who work at the Venezuelan embassy in Ljubljana years ago. We were not aware of this until we didn't read this book. But otherwise, they are selling the same product under the new names, always under the new names. So this is why it's so important to know the roots, to know the history, to know the practical cases, and not to be disgusted by this method of using new terms, new words, describing the same thing. And they are very successful with hiding the true nature. The European Museum, the Museum of the European History is a good, it's a good example. If they're so powerful even to influence, such institution, we expect it in Slovenia, as Mr. Dežman described today. We are not able to establish, to found something like was Terror Haza in Budapest or some other museums to present to the young generations what really happened during the communist system. And we expected a lot from the European Museum of the European History. And when we somehow were part of this project. But then when we saw the result, we were very disappointed. So somebody was there to influence the subject. So this is, the second most dangerous thing regarding the communism is that they were so successful taking the cultural institutions. So we thought that universities in former Yugoslavia was so heavily influenced by this theory. They were. But when we studied there, we didn't really believe what they thought. But on the western part of the Europe, young people really believed those things. No? They lived in much better conditions and they believed. And now they are professors and then they are teaching young people the same thing. This extreme left party in Slovenia, they're part of the government. In parliament they have few MPs. They are students or professors. These two categories. So this is the ground where we have to fight. And it was totally neglected. We think that the liberal democracy, multi-party elections, free market economy, all this, when we come to this freedom to have this, all problems will be solved. That the system itself will defend, will revive and defend itself. It's not true. Anything in the world can be misused, can be manipulated, and the left, they don't know how to run the country, but they know how to promise everything, but they don't, they're not serious with the delivery. So, communism is illusion, which is still on the shelves, on the political markets, unfortunately.
Next question. Yes, Daniel.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for your speech. My name is Daniel Kinst from the Center for Public Policy. It's very interesting that you mentioned the Bible and the Ten Commandments as foundations of our Western civilization. It's very interesting now to see there are some cultural Marxists who claim that there is a connection between Marxism and the Bible. So they're trying to play the Christian game to justify morally their ideology. So how would you comment on that?
Well, there is one chapter in this book, Sao Paulo Forum, Cultural Warfare, which is describing this issue. How in Latin America especially, the left and cultural Marxism was successful to persuade some priests, some bishops, to come to their side. And it's, well, they try to do this. And I'm looking for words to repeat what Alejandro has said in this book, but I'm not able to be so precise. So please read this book, and you will need this. You will get the answers. There is also a name for this misuse of the religion. This is religion of liberty, or something like that was called in Latin America. Also liberation theology, yes. We also in Slovenia, we had one bishop who was openly speaking in this direction during the communist system.
Next question, yes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. I come from a country, Spain, where we have communists in the government who say that communism is freedom. So as you say, very few nowadays say communism is good, but still in some countries are. So, but my question is not about that. It's in the good old times for the West that were the bad old times for the East, when communism was very clear and capitalism was very clear and freedom. things were relatively clear to analyze, no? But nowadays it's very difficult to analyze, no? For instance, I would like to ask you an easy question. What is the role of Putin, no? Because Putin is theoretically a moral conservative, but the four of Sao Paulo are all his allies, no? Then you have the United States, and that's now the enemy of Putin, but it's also in the same path in many things for cultural Marxism. So it's, again, in the past it was very easy to analyze, no? Good, the bad, white, black. Now it's very hard to understand what's happening. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I don't think that Putin is moral conservative.
He says.
Yeah, okay. I met him many times, so I can say from my experiences, he's KGB man. So he can be something today and something totally different next day. This is Putin, but his ideology is ideology of recreating the evil empire. This is what he is doing from the beginning, and he admitted this in his first interview he gave after he became the security advisor of former president. He said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the biggest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. So, and everything what he tried to do after that was to recreate this. And of course, the full-scale invasion on Ukraine in February last year was just one step in this plan. And he was, and he still is prepared to use everything. Tomorrow he will be able to declare himself as whatever, a bishop of Catholic Church, to come to his goal. He's also a clear example that I think that somebody mentioned during the previous panel, that when that Nazism, National Socialism, was defeated in the war, there was Nuremberg, the evil was punished, and for the communism, nothing happened. The last president of the Communist Party in Slovenia, Milan Kučan, who became then a president of the country, on the elections, which were free, but all voting commissions were established by the Communist Party. They counted the votes. There are many candidates, but they counted the votes. You know what this means. He said, the Berlin Wall, when he was asked in one of his first interviews after the changes, how he is judging his past and so on, he said, well, there were some things were good, some things were bad, of course, but look, the Berlin Wall, it fell on the both sides. So he said there are many truths. So this was his approach, and with the exception of the Ceausescu, who was killed during the revolution, I don't think that any other communist dictator was in serious trial, punished, and so on. In Slovenia, and I believe also in Croatia, there was no lustration, nothing. So in Slovenia today, politicians in the left parties, some old now, they openly admit they worked for the secret police. This was not something, well, this was work for a state, for a common good. So it's, the evil of communism was not punished. And the unpunished evil always returns. Always returns. This is why we have war in Ukraine. This is why we have Putin there. This is why we have this failure at the current NATO summit finished yesterday. The leaders of the Western world declared that they reconfirm the decision from the Bucharest from April 2008 when they promised Ukraine a membership in NATO. Well, if this happened in 2008, there is no war in Ukraine. There is no war in Europe. I was there in Bucharest at that time. I was part of this strategic failure, which didn't happen because of us from Eastern and Central Europe. United States was in favor. France and Germany blocked the Ukrainian Georgian membership for NATO. Putin came to the dinner and said, look, the Cold War is over, we are friends now, we are cooperating in Afghanistan, now it's a war on terror, we are friends and allies here, we opened our airspace for your planes to go to Afghanistan. This is criticized in Moscow, my position is not so strong. If you grant, at that time the question was not to take Ukraine and Georgia into full membership, it was a question to start the process, to give them the membership action plan. And also now in Vilnius, it was not the question Ukraine to become full member of NATO, it's a question to formally start the process. It didn't. It didn't. So Putin said, well, if you do this, you will create a situation which will be dangerous, not only for me, but somebody else will come on power in Russia, who will be not so friendly. So I don't ask you, he said, not to do it. I'm just asking you not to do it today. Maybe somewhere in the future, when the situation will be different, when my position will be more secured, and when we will be able to develop together security guarantees also for Russia. This was his words. Then there was long discussion after that, and the result was typical Western compromise. Well, not today, but in December. December never happened because Putin invaded Georgia in August. We introduced sanctions, and then, well, he also influenced the situation in Ukraine, starting to bribe the Western politicians, put them into the boards of the Lukoil or Gazprom branches across the Europe, and this is how we came to the full-scale invasion last year. And now there was a NATO summit in Vilnius where new arms were promised for Ukraine, but there was no decision to start the official process for the membership, which is the only thing which is not helping Ukraine today, but which is giving them hope, which is giving them a reason to believe that even if they liberate the country or well, at least last part of the taken territory, then the attack will not repeat after a few years. No? So all the West felt again, and well, we will see the consequences. But Putin is still there. So Putin was in Bucharest 15 years ago, and he is still the president of the Russian Federation. Among the leaders of the NATO member countries, there is nobody. There was nobody in Vilnius who was in Bucharest. They don't know. Majority of them, they don't know what happened in Bucharest. Fortunately, the only guy who was there is now Secretary General of NATO, with now again extended mandate, Stoltenberg, who was at that time Prime Minister of Norway. And he did what he could, but he has no voice. So he's just Secretary General. And the same countries which more or less blocked the right decisions 15 years ago, blocked the decisions now in Vilnius, despite all nice words you will read in newspapers. Even Zelensky changed the wording because they depend on foreign aid, especially arms and ammunition, to survive next months.
One final question, okay?
I have to thank you for mentioning Venezuela. I'm from Venezuela, my name is Daniel, and I had the experience of growing in this system. I was 8 years old when Chavez came into power, and I have to tell you all, when I came to Europe, I started seeing small things about Venezuelan reality. This is a huge problem. Many people tell me, are you crazy? It's very different here, you know, we are Europeans, we think differently. It's very difficult for here that in Europe happens a populist movement like in Venezuela. But I saw small things of the changes coming now. And it was, you know, really a bit emotional when you were talking about it, because when you grow up in that system, you start seeing stuff that are not normal. And when you come here, you start seeing little stuff, little details in speeches, in the way that politicians start doing stuff. You start feeling like maybe I'm a bit paranoid with this, or maybe, you know. And many people in the street, they don't understand this. And it's kind of relief when somebody says, yeah, something is happening, something is coming from the Venezuelan Cuban regime. Because the thing is that they developed this new socialist system that is not static. That's the main problem. It's always evolving. That's why we never managed to see what was going on, because they will change the strategy every year, and they will deceive and they demoralize the population progressively. And for that kind of strategy, it's very difficult to be prepared. So my recommendation is you have to really study American Venezuelan history in the last 15 years. It's very complicated, really complicated. They will, for example, for some elections, they will take hours and hours to count the votes. People will get tired, they will go to sleep, and while people were sleeping, they were changing everything. Or when they knew they were losing on the polls, they would change the date of the election, and they will pass it on to some vacations or stuff like that. Or if they knew they were going to do something interesting in their politics, maybe some famous guy would get killed by violence, so that will be in the papers. For other elections, they will put one guy that 30 years ago was with Chavez when he will rise against the government, and he will go to the election as an opposition, saying, oh, I know him, he was a killer, he was blah, blah, blah. And people will vote for that guy, and 5 years later, he will get a ministry in Chavez's government. So it was always deceiving and deceiving and deceiving, always with new strategies. That's why it's so important to study the case of Venezuela, because it's really complicated to decipher the strategy of these people. So thank you very much. I would like to shake your hand because you make my day talking to me about Venezuela.
So, thank you. When I read this book from Alejandro Pena-Exclusa, I found a page when he's speaking about Sao Paulo Forum, and especially money coming from Venezuela, used to establish political parties in Europe. And then I thought, look, we have totally neglected the situation in Latin America for decades. Okay, there were some protests, there were some petitions and so on, but more or less Europe and also United States, they run business as usual with those governments. There were no discussion about the influence of Sao Paulo Forum. It was not secret, but nobody mentioned this, and so on. On the other side, they did not stay in there. They tried to influence also the situation here. So Slovenian situation is not described. We know it from our experiences, but it's described the Podemos, how they created Podemos party in Spain, which is in current Spanish government, which will be defeated, I hope, on the elections coming now. But still, you know, and this government, during my time in the European Council, socialist government from Spain, always defending regimes in Cuba, Venezuela, always. They tried everything to prevent any kind of condemnation. They said, okay, they will change, we will influence them. They are for social justice, they're not so bad, maybe they made some mistakes, and so on. So I think that the West made big mistakes neglecting the situation, breeding there. But the socialists, they're cooperating across the world. They didn't forget to influence the situation in Europe. So, and a few months ago, I participated in this discussion when there was president of Conservative Party from Guatemala. He said, in Latin America, you just need to establish NGO, declaring the program of this NGO fighting for human rights, LGBT rights, and green transition. And the money is coming from European funds, from Norwegian funds. Doesn't matter what you're doing, doesn't matter for what you're using this money, election campaign, just to declare yourself, and then you go to the embassy, you said, this is my program, please help us, and the money is coming. So the Western democracies are financing heavily, you know, the cultural Marxism program in Latin America. Also some foundations from center-right parties are doing this in some Latin American countries. So I don't remember the names, but he described some cases when the NGOs who were openly supported and organized the violent protests in Colombia, for instance, were financed by European money and by money coming from drug cartels. So not imagination, but real hard proof. So, and this is why I will repeat, we have to retake the words, we have to retake the medias, we have to retake the freedom of speech to speak about this, to publish these books, to record, to make films of these things, to cooperate, to be linked. So the biggest advantage of the left is that they are very, very well connected. They're very well connected, and the conservatives, we are more closed into our national spaces.
So please join me in thanking Prime Minister Janša. We're very pleased to end the third day on this fine note, on this great occasion. Regarding all this EU money going to these NGOs. I can say for my modest Center for Renewal of Culture, we haven't received a penny nor requested money from the EU or other such sources. Our motto is better dead than red. So we resume tomorrow at 10 a.m. For the final day. We have a panel on demographics, and I urge you to come back. We've assembled an excellent panel to finish off this summer university. So please persevere and come for the final day. So we're adjourned. Thank you.